James Bieber, a 25-year-old young man, was on top of the world as the founder and CEO of a successful technology company. He had amassed a considerable fortune at a young age. From his luxurious penthouse in the heart of the city, he watched the hustle and bustle of the streets as he reflected on his life. Despite all his accomplishments and the abundance that surrounded him, James felt an inexplicable void in his heart. He knew he was adopted, and although he loved his adoptive parents deeply, he had always felt the need to know his biological roots. James had grown up in a loving home surrounded by care and affection. His adoptive parents, Emma and Oliver, had taken him in when he was just a baby and had given him every opportunity to develop and grow. They told him about his adoption when he turned 18, assuring him that they loved him unconditionally and that he would always be their son, no matter where he came from. Despite the gratitude he felt toward them, James couldn't help but wonder why his birth parents had given him up for adoption and what they would be like. As the years passed, James's curiosity intensified. As his business grew and his fortune increased, he began to devote more time and resources to the search for his birth parents. He hired a team of private investigators to assist him in his mission. But information was scarce and dead ends were frequent. However, James did not give up. He was determined to find answers and close that pending chapter in his life. Finally, after months of tireless searching, investigators were able to locate James's biological parents. Carmen Sanchez and Luis Martinez lived in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, just a few hours away. James felt a mixture of emotions upon receiving the news. Excitement, nervousness, and a little fear. What would his birth parents be like? Why had they given him up for adoption? Would they welcome him with open arms or reject him? Despite his doubts, James knew he had to face this situation. He made the decision to visit his birth parents, but with an unexpected twist. Instead of presenting himself as the successful millionaire he was, he decided to disguise himself as a humble, unemployed young man. He wanted to meet them without money interfering with their first encounter, without prejudice or expectations clouding the truth. James was determined to find out who Carmen and Luis really were and whether the decision to give him up for adoption had been driven by love or for other reasons. With his heart beating a mile a minute, James prepared for the most important meeting of his life. He knew this journey would take him to unfamiliar places, both emotionally and physically, but he was ready to face it. The search for his identity and the answers he longed for was about to begin. James looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. He had traded in his expensive designer suit for worn, baggy clothes and had combed his hair back in a sloppy style. His appearance reflected that of a young man who had fallen on hard times, someone struggling to make ends meet. It was the perfect facade for his plan to visit his biological parents without revealing his true identity. As he prepared to leave, James couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was excited to finally meet the people who had given him life, the ones he had searched for so long. On the other hand, nervousness gripped him at the thought of how they would react to seeing him. Would they recognize him in any way? Would they feel some instant connection? With a shaky sigh, James left his penthouse and headed toward the modest neighborhood where Carmen and Luis lived. As he moved away from the comfort of his luxurious life, he entered a completely different world. The well-kept streets and imposing buildings gave way to more humble neighborhoods with simple homes and small family businesses. After a bus ride and a walk through unfamiliar streets, James finally arrived at the address the researchers had given him. He found himself in front of a modest house with faded paint and a small garden at the entrance. His heart pounded as he approached the door, trying to muster the courage to knock. Before knocking, James took a moment to reflect on his life and the path that had led him there. He thought about his adoptive parents, Emma and Oliver, and all the love and support they had given him over the years. He wondered how they would feel if they knew what he was about to do, but he knew they would understand his need to seek answers. With a deep sigh, James finally knocked on the door. The seconds seemed eternal as he waited, his heart racing and his palms sweaty. Suddenly, the door opened, and James found himself face to face with a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes. It was Carmen, his biological mother. For a moment, they both stared at each other as if trying to recognize each other. Carmen looked at him with a mixture of confusion and curiosity, not knowing who this young stranger standing in her doorway was. James, for his part, struggled to hold back tears at the sight of the face of the woman who had given him life. Finally, James broke the silence. In a trembling voice, he introduced himself as a young man looking for work. inventing a story about how he had arrived in the neighborhood by chance. Carmen, though a bit suspicious at first, felt compassion for the young man and invited him in for a glass of water and some rest. As James entered the house, he realized that he was about to embark on an intense emotional journey. He was about to meet the people who had made the hardest decision of their lives by giving him up for adoption, and he didn't know what to expect. But he was determined to discover the truth, no matter how painful or complicated it might be. Upon entering Carmen and Luis's humble abode, James was greeted with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. The interior of the house reflected simple living, with worn furniture and walls in need of a coat of paint. Carmen guided him into the small living room where she offered him a seat on a faded sofa. James surveyed his surroundings, trying to imagine what his life would have been like if he had grown up there. Would he have had the same opportunities? Would he have achieved the success he now enjoyed? These questions haunted his mind as he waited for Carmen to return with the promised glass of water. A few minutes later, Carmen returned, accompanied by a tired-looking man with deep wrinkles furrowing his face. It was Luis, James's biological father. They both sat across from him, looking at him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. James, remembering his alibi, began to tell a fictitious story about his life. He told them that he had grown up in foster care, struggling to get by in a world that seemed to be against him. He made up details about low-paying jobs and dashed dreams, painting a picture of a young man who had faced numerous obstacles. As he spoke, James carefully studied Carmen and Luis's reactions. He noticed how they exchanged furtive glances, as if they were communicating silently. Did they suspect something? Did they see through his disguise and recognize the son they had given up for adoption so many years ago? Despite the initial awkwardness, the conversation began to flow more naturally. Carmen and Luis shared some details about their own lives, revealing the economic hardships they had faced and the sacrifices they had made to make ends meet. James listened intently, trying to find some clue as to the reasons behind their adoption. At one point, Carmen got up and went to the kitchen, offering to prepare something to eat for their unexpected guest. James accepted the offer, grateful for the opportunity to extend his visit and get more information. While Carmen prepared the meal, Luis began to ask James questions about his life and his plans for the future. James improvised answers, painting a bleak picture of an aimless young man struggling to find his place in the world. He watched Luis's expression darken, as if he was remembering something painful. The meal passed in an atmosphere of awkward politeness. James struggled to maintain his facade while Carmen and Luis seemed to be deep in their own thoughts. There was an underlying tension in the air, as if everyone was dancing around an undisclosed secret. As the visit dragged on, James realized that his biological parents seemed restless and anxious for him to leave. Did his presence remind them of a decision they would rather forget, or was there something deeper and more painful hidden behind their discomfort? James knew he was playing a dangerous game by hiding his true identity, but he was determined to see it through to the end. He needed answers, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths and opening old wounds. With each passing minute, he got closer to unraveling the mystery surrounding his adoption and understanding the motivations behind the decision that had shaped his life. As the conversation progressed, James decided to take a risk and delve deeper into his fictional story. With a lump in his throat, he revealed to Carmen and Luis that he was currently unemployed and struggling financially. He described nights without a roof over his head and days without food, painting a heartbreaking picture of a young man on the brink of despair. As he spoke, James watched his biological parents' reactions intently. He expected to see some hint of empathy or understanding on their faces, some sign that they were touched by his story. What he saw, however, left him perplexed and deeply hurt. Instead of showing compassion, Carmen and Luis exchanged looks of disdain and disapproval. Their expressions hardened, and their words became cold and cutting. With a mixture of arrogance and relief, they told James that they had made the right decision in giving him up for adoption, as they clearly could not have offered him a better life. Each word was like a stab in James's heart. He had expected to find some understanding, perhaps even a hint of regret, but instead, he was met with an attitude of superiority and contempt. Carmen and Luis seemed convinced that they had done the right thing by removing him from their lives, as if they had avoided an unwanted burden. James struggled to maintain his composure, swallowing the tears that threatened to well up in his eyes. Disappointment and grief washed over him, but he refused to break down in front of them. Instead, he listened in silence as Carmen and Luis continued to talk, each word more hurtful than the last. They told him it had been a difficult decision but a necessary one, that they would not have been able to give him the life he deserved, that they would have been inadequate parents. They spoke of their own struggle to survive, of the sacrifices they had had to make just to make ends meet, and through it all, they made it clear that giving James up for adoption had been a relief, a way to free themselves from a responsibility they couldn't handle. James felt his heart break into pieces with every word. He had hoped to find a little love, a little regret, but instead he found rejection and indifference. He realized that to Carmen and Luis, he was nothing more than a distant memory, a decision made long ago and buried in the past. Despite the pain he felt, James stood firm. He knew that revealing his true identity at that moment would only make things worse. He didn't want to see the greed or sudden interest in their eyes upon discovering that the poor young man in front of them was actually a successful millionaire. With a lump in his throat, James stood up and thanked them for their time. He told them that he understood their decision and that he didn't blame them for what they had done, but inside he felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, disappointment, and a deep sense of loss. As he headed for the door, James wondered if he could ever forgive his birth parents for the way they had treated him. Did they deserve his forgiveness, or were there some wounds that were simply too deep to heal? With a broken heart and a mind full of questions, James prepared to face the next phase of his journey. He knew the truth would be painful, but he was determined to see it through to the end. After all, he had come too far to give up now. James left his birth parents' home with a broken heart and a mind full of confusion. Carmen and Luis's hurtful words echoed in his ears, and the feeling of rejection clung to him like a heavy blanket. He walked through the unfamiliar streets, lost in thought, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. Just when he felt he could no longer bear the weight of his emotions, a familiar sound brought him out of his reverie. The soft purr of a luxury engine was approaching, and James looked up to see his private chauffeur pulling the sleek car to a stop at the curb. The contrast between his reality and the charade he had presented to his birth parents could not have been more stark. With a mixture of relief and embarrassment, James approached the car. The chauffeur, a discreet and loyal man who had worked for him for years, immediately noticed his boss's emotional state. Without asking questions, he opened the back door and waited for James to settle into the leather seat. As the car drove away from that modest neighborhood, James looked out the window, watching the houses and streets fade into the distance. The gulf between his world and that of his birth parents seemed unbridgeable, and he wondered if he could ever find common ground. In the back seat of the car, James finally allowed himself to break down. The tears he had held back for so long welled up in his eyes and sobs shook his body. The chauffeur, respectful of his boss's privacy, pulled up the partition separating the driver's cab from the back, giving James the space he needed to vent. As the luxury car made its way through the city streets, James thought of the expression of shock and disbelief he had seen on Carmen and Luis's faces when they saw the vehicle. It was as if, for a brief moment, they had glimpsed James's true identity, but they quickly dismissed the idea as impossible. James wondered what they would have thought if they had known the truth. Would they have changed their attitude toward him? Would they have shown remorse for their hurtful words, or would they simply have seen in him an opportunity to profit from his success? These questions haunted James as the car drove into the most exclusive streets of the city. Finally, they arrived at his building, an imposing skyscraper that housed his luxurious penthouse. James thanked his chauffeur and headed for the elevator, eager to retreat to the comfort of his home. Once inside his penthouse, James plopped down on the couch, emotionally and physically exhausted. He looked around at the luxurious furnishings and artwork adorning the walls and felt more alone than ever. All his success, all his wealth seemed empty in comparison to the longing for connection and belonging he felt. He knew that the encounter with his birth parents had been only the beginning of a much longer journey. There were unanswered questions, wounds that needed to be healed, and a truth that was yet to be discovered. But for now, James allowed himself to simply feel, letting the tears flow and the pain wash over him. In the solitude of his penthouse, James promised himself that he would not give up. He would keep searching for answers, keep struggling to understand his past and find his place in the world. Because despite the rejection and the pain, he knew his story wasn't over, and he was determined to write his own ending. An ending in which love and understanding would triumph over resentment and indifference. After spending the night immersed in his thoughts and emotions, James awoke with new determination. He knew he could not let the painful encounter with his birth parents define his search for the truth. There were questions that still needed answers, and he was determined to find them. With a clearer mind, James went to his study and began to review the information his researchers had compiled on Carmen and Luis. He examined every detail, searching for any clue that might shed light on the circumstances surrounding their adoption. As he dove deeper into the documents, James discovered that his birth parents had fallen on hard times before his birth. Luis had lost his job and was struggling to find steady employment, while Carmen worked long hours in a factory for minimum wage. The couple lived on the brink of poverty, struggling to make ends meet. These details made James further question the reasons behind his adoption. Had it really been a decision made out of love, as he had always wanted to believe, or had it simply been a way to escape a desperate situation? Determined to learn more, James contacted the adoption agency that had handled his case. He requested access to any records or documents related to his adoption, hoping to find some clue that might help him better understand his birth parents' motivations. While waiting for the agency's response, James also began researching adoption laws and procedures at the time he was born. He wanted to understand the legal and social context in which the decision to place him for adoption had been made, and whether there was any possibility of irregularities or outside pressures involved. As he became more immersed in his research, James realized that he was opening a Pandora's box. Each new piece of information raised more questions and generated more uncertainty. Had Carmen and Luis considered other options before opting for adoption? Had they received any counseling or support during the process? Was there any possibility that they had been coerced or pressured into making that decision? These questions weighed on James as he continued to investigate. He knew that the truth could be painful, but he also understood that it was necessary in order to move forward and find the peace he longed for. Finally, after weeks of waiting, James received a response from the adoption agency. They informed him that they had some records related to his case and were willing to share them with him. With his heart racing, James scheduled an appointment to review the documents in person. As he prepared to face this new chapter in his search, James couldn't help but feel a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that the records might shed light on the circumstances of his adoption and the true motivations of his birth parents, and fear that the truth might be even more painful than he imagined. But despite his fears, James knew he couldn't turn back. He had come too far to give up now. With courage and determination, he prepared to face whatever the adoption records had in store for him, knowing that each step brought him closer to the truth he so longed for. The day of the appointment at the adoption agency arrived, and James found himself sitting in a small waiting room, his heart pounding in his chest. Anticipation and nervousness mingled inside him as he waited for the social worker to call him to review the records related to his case. After what seemed like an eternity, the office door opened, and a middle-aged woman with a warm smile invited him in. James followed her in, trying to calm his nerves as he sat across from her at a small desk. The social worker, whose name was Laura, explained to James that she had compiled all the available documents about his adoption. Gently, she handed him a folder of yellowed, weather-worn papers. With trembling hands, James opened the folder and began to review its contents. There were application forms, medical reports, and correspondence between the agency and his adoptive parents. But what caught his attention most were the handwritten letters from Carmen and Luis. With his heart pounding, James began to read the words his birth parents had put on paper so many years before. In the letters, they expressed their love for the baby they were about to give up for adoption and the deep sadness they felt at having to make that decision. Carmen wrote about how she had dreamed of having a child of her own, but that life circumstances had prevented them from giving her the home and stability she deserved. Luis, meanwhile, talked about his struggle to find work and how he didn't want his son to grow up